The notification hit my phone at 6:47 inches the morning, and I lay there in my childhood bed reading it without blinking. A hard inquiry on my credit. A loan application. My name. My social security number. My signature, except I hadn't signed anything. I put the phone face down on the mattress and stared at the water stain on the ceiling I'd memorized at age 9. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just thought, there it is. People who know me now would find it hard to believe I ever slept in that house. The woman who runs 3 engineering teams across 2 time zones, who bought her first commercial property at 26, who has a Slack notification sound that makes her direct reports flinch. That woman grew up in a 3-bedroom ranch house in suburban Ohio where the rule was simple and unspoken. My brother mattered, and I was a placeholder until someone figured out what to do with me. My brother is 4 years older than me. His name doesn't matter. What matters is that from the time I was old enough to understand the difference, I watched my parents build their entire emotional universe around him. When he got a B, my father took him out for ice cream to celebrate the effort. When I got straight A's, my mother said, "Don't make your brother feel bad." When he crashed the family car at 17, my dad told him accidents happen. When I asked to borrow it at 20 to drive to a job interview, I was told I wasn't responsible enough. I stopped asking for things around age 12. I started building them instead. By the time I was finishing my computer science degree, I had already been freelancing for 2 years under a business name I'd registered quietly, Opaline Systems. Nothing fancy. Small contracts. A local law firm needed their document management rebuilt. A dental office wanted a patient portal. I charged what the market would bear and saved everything I made. My parents thought I spent my weekends studying. I did, in a way. I never told them about the money. I want to be clear about why. Because the comment I've heard most in my life is some version of, "Why didn't you just leave?" The answer is that I was watching. My father had a small electrical contracting business that had been slowly hemorrhaging money for years because his bookkeeping was done on paper and his invoicing system was a spiral notebook. I knew, because I had fixed their home computer enough times to see files I wasn't supposed to see, that my parents were 4 months behind on the mortgage when I turned 22. I also knew that my brother, who had moved back home after his second failed attempt at a sales career, was contributing exactly nothing. So I made a decision that probably sounds strange from the outside. I started paying their mortgage without telling them. Not through a check with my name on it, through a property management company I set up, which I told them was a new service their bank was offering. My mother asked once why the statement looked different. I told her it was a redesign. She nodded and went back to her coffee. I kept working. I kept saving. I kept my mouth shut about what I was building. Opaline Systems wasn't small anymore by the time I was 28. I had 11 contractors, 2 full-time employees, and a client list that included a regional hospital network and a logistics company that operated in 6 states. I had incorporated properly, retained a business attorney, and begun a quiet acquisition process on a commercial property, 12 minutes from my parents' house, a small office park, 4 tenants, steady income. My name wasn't on any of it publicly. The holding entity was called Clearwater Property Group, and if you looked it up, you'd find a registered agent in Delaware, and nothing else. I was still driving the same 7-year-old Civic. I wore the same rotation of unremarkable clothes. I ate lunch at my desk most days and kept a studio apartment on the east side of the city that nobody in my family knew existed. Why did I still have a room at my parents' house? Because I was the one quietly keeping the lights on, and because I had learned something important about people like my father. They don't believe what they can't see. As long as I looked like the daughter who hadn't quite figured her life out, no one was going to ask me for anything I wasn't ready to give. The moment I looked successful, the asks would start, and the asks from people like my family don't come with repayment plans. I was also, if I'm honest, waiting. For what? I couldn't have told you exactly. I just had a feeling. My brother announced his engagement in October. Her name was Courtney, and she was pleasant enough in the way that people are pleasant when they want something from your family. She had strong opinions about kitchen layouts and referred to herself in the third person when excited, which happened often. My parents were ecstatic. My father cried. My mother immediately began talking about the wedding as though it were her own. 2 weeks after the engagement, my mother sat me down at the kitchen table and told me that she and my father had been thinking. They wanted to give my brother and Courtney the master bedroom. They were going to renovate nothing major, just a fresh coat of paint, some new flooring. They would convert my room into a sitting room for the couple to have their own space. It would be better for everyone. Where would I sleep? I asked. My mother looked at me with the particular expression she reserved for questions she found tiresome. "We thought you could find a place of your own," she said. "You're 29 years old, sweetheart. It's time." "I've had a place of my own," I said. "I've had one for 3 years. That surprised her. She recovered quickly. Well then, it should be easy. What she didn't say, but what lived in every syllable of that conversation. My brother was the future of this family. His comfort, his marriage, his happiness required space and investment. Mine required a polite suggestion to figure it out. I had known this for 20 years, Hearing it out loud in the kitchen where I had learned to read was something different. My father came in from the garage while I was still sitting there. He didn't look at me for more than a second. "Your brother needs stability right now," he said. Like that explained everything. Like stability was a finite resource and he'd already allocated mine to someone else at birth. I took my coffee mug to the sink, rinsed it, set it on the drying rack. I said, "Okay." My father blinked. I think he'd been prepared for a fight. "That's it?" "That's it," I said. I walked to my room, packed what I actually cared about into 2 bags, and left before dinner. I didn't slam the door. I didn't make a speech. I drove to my studio apartment, made myself a bowl of pasta, and opened my laptop to check on a project that was 3 days from delivery. I had been gone for 6 days when my brother called me. He needed to talk, he said. "Could we meet for coffee?" He was in the booth at the back of a diner near the highway when I arrived, and he had his hands wrapped around a mug in a way that told me he was nervous. My brother is not good at hiding things. He never learned to, because he never had to. He started with small talk I didn't participate in. Then he told me that he and Courtney had found a venue. Gorgeous place. Exposed brick. Held 200 people. The only issue was the deposit was due before his year-end bonus, and he was a little tight right now, just temporarily, because they'd also put down money on a car for Courtney. Nothing crazy. Just, "How much?" I said. 40,000. I looked at him. He looked at the table. "I'll pay you back before the wedding," he said. "I just need it as a bridge." "I don't have $40,000, I said. This was, technically, true. I had considerably more, distributed across accounts he had no knowledge of. He looked frustrated. "Come on. You've been working forever. You've got to have something saved." "I have some savings," I said. "Not 40,000. He left the diner annoyed. I drove home and noted the conversation in a document I'd been keeping for about 6 months, a quiet running record of things my family said and did. My attorney had suggested it, not in the context of anything specific, just as general good practice for someone in business. I had found it clarifying. The credit alert came 3 weeks later. I didn't panic. I called my bank's fraud line from my car and was told that a personal loan application had been submitted in my name the previous afternoon for $35,000. The representative confirmed the application had been denied. My credit profile had flagged it for review because of inconsistencies in the employment documentation. My employment documentation, meaning someone had submitted paperwork claiming I worked somewhere and earned an amount inconsistent with my actual filing history. Someone who had access to my social security number, my date of birth, my home address. Someone who had been in the same house as my important documents for 29 years. I asked the representative to flag the application as fraudulent and initiate a formal dispute. I told her I would be filing a police report. She thanked me for calling promptly. Then I sat in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store for about 4 minutes. I thought about calling my brother directly. I thought about calling my parents. I thought about driving back to that house and standing in the kitchen and asking my father, clearly and specifically, whether he knew that his son had committed bank fraud using his daughter's identity. I didn't do any of those things. I called my attorney instead. Her name is Diane, and she has been practicing law for 23 years. And when I told her what had happened, she said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do." We filed the police report. We secured a fraud alert on all 3 of my credit bureaus. Diane contacted the bank formally, on letterhead, and requested the complete application documentation. What came back was exactly what I expected and worse than I hoped. A loan application with my signature on it. A forgery that was not particularly good. And an attached employment verification letter claiming I was a salaried employee of my father's electrical contracting business, earning $68,000 a year. I had never worked for my father's business. I had never been on its payroll. I had never received a single check from it in my life. What I had done, starting 4 years earlier, was become its landlord. My father's business operated out of a commercial unit in a small office park on the east side of the city. He'd been renting that unit for 11 years. 2 years ago, when the previous owner sold the property, one of the 4 buyers in the acquiring entity was Clearwater Property Group, which meant that for the past 2 years, my father had been writing his monthly rent check to a company I controlled. He didn't know this. Why would he? The name on the lease renewal was Clearwater. His accountant processed the checks. He'd never had reason to look further. I had never planned to use this. I want to be clear about that. I hadn't bought the property to create leverage over my father. I bought it because it was a good investment, and I had the capital. The fact that his business was a tenant was something I discovered during due diligence, and noted without particular emotion. It was information. I filed it, and moved on. But now his son had forged my signature on a federal loan application, and someone had provided documentation claiming I was a company employee in an attempt to support that fraud. And that company was my father's. Diane and I talked for a long time that evening. She laid out the options clearly, and without editorializing, which is one of the things I pay her for. There was a version of this that ended with charges filed, a criminal proceeding, my brother facing potential federal exposure. There was a version that ended with a civil settlement. There was a version I could control, and a version that would be taken out of my hands the moment certain parties were notified. I asked her what she recommended. She said, "I think you should let them hear it from you first. Then we proceed." I thought about that water stain on the ceiling of my childhood bedroom. I thought about my mother's face when she told me it was time to find a place of my own. I thought about my father saying my brother needed stability, like I was furniture they'd decided to donate. "Schedule the meeting," I said. My father suggested his house. I said no. I suggested a conference room at Diane's firm downtown, and after a short silence he agreed. He brought my mother and my brother. I brought Diane. Courtney was not invited and did not come. They arrived 7 minutes late. My brother looked like he hadn't slept. My mother had dressed carefully, which she does when she's anxious. My father sat down across from me and looked at Diane like she was a problem he was trying to size up. "We didn't know this needed lawyers," he said. "It does," Diane said. I let Diane walk them through it. The fraud alert, the application, the forgery, the employment letter. She was calm and methodical, and she placed printed copies in front of each of them as she spoke, because documentation is how you make sure people can't later claim they didn't understand. My brother started talking before she finished. He was saying it was a mistake. It was a miscommunication. He'd meant to ask me first, and then things got complicated, and he thought I wouldn't mind, because I'd been helping anyway. "You thought she wouldn't mind," Diane said, not as a question. I was going to pay her back. "The loan was denied," Diane said. "So you weren't going to pay anything back. You were going to have a record of fraud attached to your sister's credit history." My mother looked at me. This was the first time since they'd sat down that she'd looked directly at me. Her expression was something I didn't have a word for, not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of someone who has just been shown a thing they would have preferred not to see. My father said, "What do you want?" This was, I think, the most honest thing he'd said to me in years. Not "I'm sorry." Not "this was wrong." Just, "What's it going to cost me?" I looked at him for a moment. Then I reached into the folder in front of me and slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was a tenant notice. Formal, legally compliant, 60-day notice of lease non-renewal for the commercial unit at 4400 Brennan Industrial Drive, Suite C. My father picked it up. "Read it. Put it down. This is our building." "It's my building," I said. "Has been for 2 years. Clearwater Property Group is mine." The room was very quiet. My mother said, "What?" I said it again, more slowly. "Clearwater Property Group. The entity that had purchased the property park 2 years ago. The landlord whose checks my father had been writing every single month. Me." My father's face went through several things in quick succession. Disbelief, calculation, something that might have been fear. "You can't just," he started. "The lease expires in 60 days, Diane said. "The notice is valid and properly served." "I've been in that building for 11 years. And I've been your daughter for 29, I said. "We've both been operating on assumptions that turned out to be wrong." My brother had gone very still. He was looking at the table. I turned to him. "The bank has your application on file. The forgery is documented. The employment letter with false information is attached to it. That's bank fraud. That's identity theft. Those aren't things I invented, that's what the statutes say. What happens next depends on some choices you make in the next 30 days. He looked up. "Are you going to press charges?" "I filed a police report," I said. "That's already done. What I do beyond that is a conversation that can happen through Diane." My mother's hands were flat on the table. She said, very quietly, "We didn't know he was going to do that." "I believe you," I said. And I did, mostly. What I also believed was that they had created the conditions for it, the sense that my identity, my credit, my effort, was a communal resource the family could draw on, without asking. Because I had always been the one in the background making things work without acknowledgement or reciprocity. I didn't say that. It wasn't the moment for it. And I had already decided that I was not going to spend the rest of my life explaining myself to people who had already decided what I was worth. My father said, "The business will have nowhere to go in 60 days. There are commercial spaces available in this market," Diane said. "We can provide a list if that would be helpful." He stared at her. Then he looked at me. For the first time in my memory, he had nothing to add. I closed my folder. I stood up. Diane stood up beside me. "I hope the wedding is beautiful," I said. I meant it. In the detached way you can mean things that no longer concern you. I won't be there. The 60 days passed. My father's business moved to a smaller unit across town, a downgrade in square footage and location that cost him 2 clients who had known him primarily by address. My brother accepted a civil agreement brokered through Diane restitution for my legal costs. No admission of criminal guilt in exchange for my agreement not to pursue federal charges, provided there were no further incidents. My mother texted me once to say she hoped I was doing okay. I replied that I was and left it there. I sold my studio apartment and used the capital to purchase a second commercial property. I hired a 4th full-time employee at Opaline Systems. I started running in the mornings, which I hadn't done since college, and I found that I was very good at it when I wasn't also carrying everything else. I want to talk for a moment about the thing people always get wrong about stories like mine, because I've seen it in comments. I've seen it in the way people respond when they hear pieces of it, the assumption that the goal was revenge, that I had been planning since childhood to maneuver my family into a position where I could lower the hammer, that I spent years quietly accumulating power for the specific purpose of using it against them. That's not what happened. What happened is that I spent years building something real because building things was the only part of my life that made complete sense to me. The business, the properties, the careful financial architecture, none of it was a trap. It was just my life, the one I had constructed in the margins of a family that wasn't particularly interested in who I was. The trap built itself. All I did was refuse to dismantle it when it caught the people who had spent decades telling me to be smaller. There's a difference between revenge and consequences. Revenge is something you plan. Consequences are something that arrive when the structure you've built finally meets the behavior you've been watching for years. I didn't evict my father's business out of anger. I did it because his son had committed a federal crime using my identity, and the implicit message from my father across that conference table was still, "What do you want?" Not, "I'm sorry." And I understood then that nothing had changed and nothing was going to, and that the kindest thing I could do for myself was to stop being the invisible foundation of a house that would never acknowledge I was holding it up. The office park looks the same from the outside. The tenants in the other 3 units are still there. A physical therapy practice, an insurance agency, a small accounting firm. I drove by it last week for no particular reason, just because I was in the area, and I sat in my car for a moment looking at Suite C, which now has a new sign in the window for a printing company that moved in 6 weeks ago. I thought about my father sitting across from me in that conference room, the way he'd said this is our building with such certainty, like belonging was something he could assert into existence. Like 11 years of writing rent checks to a name on paper had given him some claim that superseded the deed. I thought about my mother at the kitchen table, telling me it was time to find a place of my own, as if I hadn't already done that 3 years prior in the quiet way I'd done everything without announcement, without needing a single thing from them. I turned the car around and drove home. Home is a condo I own on the 4th floor of a building downtown, with a window that faces east and gets good light in the mornings when I'm drinking my coffee before the first calls start. It is not large. It is exactly what I need. Nobody had a room there before me, and nobody is going to take it over to give someone else more space. Opaline Systems has 17 employees now. We're in the middle of a contract with a hospital network that will run 18 months and represents the largest single project I've managed. Last quarter, I hired a director of operations so I can focus on the work I'm actually good at instead of the administrative weight of running a growing company. She is thorough and direct and sends very short emails, which I appreciate. My brother got married in April. I heard this from a cousin who still talks to both branches of the family. The venue was different from the original one, smaller, no exposed brick. I imagine the $40,000 deposit was not available to them after all. I hope the day was exactly what they wanted. I don't have a relationship with my parents. This is not a wound I carry around, it's just a fact. The way it's a fact that I prefer tea to coffee, and can't watch horror movies past 10 p.m. without regretting it. Some families are not something you can fix from the inside, no matter how long you stay, or how quietly you work, or how completely you make yourself useful. I stayed long enough to know that. I left when I knew it. What I have instead, the friend who runs a bakery 2 blocks from my condo and saves me the end-of-day sourdough on Fridays. The hiking group I joined in February, that meets at 7 on Saturday mornings, and requires me to be somewhere other than in front of a screen. The work I built with my own hands out of nothing, in the margins of a life that kept telling me I didn't quite fit. I used to think the anger would be the thing that lasted. The particular specific anger of being made to feel like a burden in a house you were quietly keeping afloat. Of watching your identity get used like a tool by someone who had never in his life treated you like a person. Of sitting across from your father and hearing "what do you want" when what you wanted, for 20 years, was just for him to see you. The anger is not the thing that lasted. Something quieter lasted. Something that feels, most mornings, like enough. I pulled my phone out last Tuesday and opened my banking app, the way I do most mornings, quickly. The way you check weather, just to know the shape of the day. I moved a transfer, approved a payroll run, looked at the property management dashboard for 30 seconds. Then I put my phone in my pocket and went for a run. And the city was cold and gray and completely indifferent to everything I'd built and everything I'd lost, and my feet hit the pavement at a pace I've gotten used to. And I didn't think about my father or my brother or the house in Ohio or the person I used to be when I slept under that water-stained ceiling. I just ran. I was just a person running through a city that didn't know my name. That is, it turns out, exactly what I wanted.